Hello, beautiful community. Let's talk about 1000 days of war. We are living through a collapsing post 1989 global order. Putin didn't break it when he invaded Ukraine, as some commentators like to say. He invaded Ukraine because the global order was largely broken. Many things broke it, but our own contribution is part of that story too, and Iraq stands tallest among such considerations. That's parallel to a rift between citizenries and their governments in the West that started in the early 70s and has recently been accelerating. That has many consequences for domestic democratic backsliding, which we often discuss. But for today's purposes, we just need to remind ourselves that it has a huge consequence for the West's capacity to project coherent power across the globe. So if you don't have democratic capacity, you don't have strategic capacity, you don't have the capacity to approach conflict strategically on the global stage. And it's possible that Ukraine is the last example of sustained Western projection of power. That's possible. Why did the war happen? It's not the same question as why Putin invaded. So let's just talk about why Putin invaded. And he invaded for two reasons. He invaded in 2014, but he invaded full scale in 2022. And the first block of reasons are regime security reasons that are cartoonishly expressed in the idea that an independent Ukraine is an existential threat to Putin's sustenance in power, and therefore in his mind a threat to Russia, and therefore in his mind a threat to his own physical body. The second set of reasons is actually somewhat mystical, a set of mystical considerations driving foreign escalation, taking Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. And that, in a certain sense too, is a kind of defeat for the images of the post-1989 global order. Because one of the thoughts that went with it is the idea that if not now, then eventually global actors will begin to act within a certain bracket of rationality. What Putin is showing us isn't that some actors are irrational, but that what we take rationality to be needs to be much wider than the sort of thing that motivates Western powers. Who is winning? Well, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is a long-distance act of self-harm, almost certainly, and self-annihilation, possibly, for Russia. But that's different to how Ukraine and Russia will be doing a year or 2 years or 3 years from now. When I said that this is a large, long-distance historical act of self-harm, could be talking of a trajectory of 10, 20 years for Russia. But when you talk about how each side is faring militarily, politically, and economically, no judgment about one side makes sense unless you make it relative to how the other side is doing in the same respect. Mark Galeotti said something today that is fair, and that is that Russia is losing the war, but Ukraine is losing the war more quickly. And I do think that at the moment, Ukraine is more vulnerable both economically and politically than Russia, even though Russia is vulnerable economically and vulnerable politically too. What can Trump do about this? Trump's default position is likely to be to offer a very painful deal for Ukraine that gives a lot to Putin. But if Putin rejects that, as he is plausibly bound to do, and once more, the question is then going to be, how will Trump react? And a hope that is just a hope, but we don't want to say that it's nothing more than a fantasy for Ukraine, is that could then make Trump a more proactive supporter of Ukraine than many expect. So that's not the default expectation, but it's a minority scenario that nevertheless could realistically come about. So we're in a very difficult situation, a situation in which there is not just a set of global challenges, but a feeling of inertia, a feeling of incapacity around addressing them. And that starts with the problems that Western countries have at home in their democracies. But don't catastrophize the state of our democracies. They're in crisis, but they're not collapsing. And don't rule out the possibility of multiple scenarios, better and worse, still being available for the realization of this conflict. Lots of love for the moment.